I'm Joe Kopsick, independent candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives from Wisconsin's 2nd Congressional District in 2012. 5 candidates, 1 Republican and 4 Democrats, have stated an interest to seek their party's nominations for the office of U.S. Representative. The Republican is former party nominee, small business owner, and musician Chad Lee, and the Democrats are small business owner and Wisconsin State Assemblyman Mark Pocan, attorney and State Assemblywoman Kelda Roys, Dane County Treasurer Dave Worzala, and veteran and attorney Matt Silverman. Chad Lee, the Republican who ran against Tammy Baldwin in 2010, is the former co-owner of the Better Butler cleaning service. Better Butler is now owned by his brother Bo, who once played with Chad in a Christian rock band called Rex Lex. The Lee's father is a Pentecostal minister at Life Church in Mount Horeb. Chad Lee has expressed interest in ending federal funding for the teaching of evolution and promoted the teaching of intelligent design in schools. His brother has urged fans of Rex Lex to read the Bible like it's a history book. Lee also supports the building of a fence along the length of the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as Arizona's immigration policy. Democratic Wisconsin State Assemblyman Mark Pocan has opposed legislation amending the state constitution to limit government spending during his service in the state assembly. Despite claiming that he would like to help small businesses obtain the capital they need in order to grow, Pocan, a small business owner himself, opposed a small business tax credit bill while in the legislature. Pocan also has a flawed record in promoting the freedom of choice and in protecting the privacy of the doctor-patient relationship by opposing a bill requiring doctors to verify the uncoerced, independent consent of the patient by dismissing any potentially influential third parties. Additionally, Pocan has a poor record promoting the right to bear arms. He has opposed concealed carry laws and supported civil liability for homeowners using deadly force against intruders in order to prevent imminent death. A realization of Pocan's policy would compromise people's ability to defend themselves against their government. Democratic State Representative Kelda Roys joined Mark Pocan in his support of former Governor Jim Doyle's ban on smoking in public places and private places of employment throughout Wisconsin, and in Pocan's opposition to the sale of alcohol to supervised 18 to 20-year-olds, concealed carry laws, and civil liability for homeowners against violent intruders. Democratic Treasurer of Dane County Dave Worzala has stated that he does not believe in the rhetoric of no new taxes. He believes that raising levels of spending and taxation, including a repeal of the Bush tax cuts, will solve the federal budget crisis, and he would also support continued federal investment in the national infrastructure. Veteran and attorney Matt Silverman has stated that he would support the increase of federal taxes, incorrectly believes that the United States is a democracy, and describes himself as a pragmatic Democrat. I join Mark Pocan in his support for a sensible policy on illicit drugs and freedom for Wisconsin's LGBTQ community from institutional public sector discrimination. I would praise his aversion to risking appeasement by legislation providing for insufficient tax credits for small businesses, and against risking increasing the financial and labor burden on women's health facilities in the state by mandating unnecessary medical procedures and the transmission of excessive information. I share Matt Silverman's desires to decrease federal spending and to stay amenable to accommodation of others' views in order to bring about substantive change. I would praise him for taking a principled personal stance in opposition to the big budget campaign finance of business interests and for supporting the democratic aspects of our republic. I join Kelda Roys in her steadfast support for the freedom of choice in regards to abortion, and in her support for gay rights in Wisconsin's public sector. I join Dave Worzala in his desire to curb federal spending, end the deficit, and change the tax code, and I support his having called attention to the need to improve the nation's infrastructure. I join Chad Lee in his concerns about our tax policy and our ability to balance budgets, and in his support for fiscal restraint, free market solutions, limited government, and nullification. However, I am running for the U.S. House of Representatives because I feel that none of these candidates sufficiently represent my views, and because I am concerned that for any of them to be elected could risk increasing political contention and deepening social and cultural conflict. I would counteract this by showing that the range of acceptable political positions is becoming broader and more nuanced, and that independent and third-party candidates are an important source for original and unique policy positions. Theory of government. Unlike some of my Democratic opponents, I do not believe that we are more free the more democratic the federal government becomes, and the more it encroaches on the rights of states and on the people thereof. Like my Republican opponent Chad Lee, I support states' rights and nullification, in addition to a sharply limited federal government. I would describe myself as a small r Republican independent, and a dual federalist in regards to constitutional theory. As a member of Congress, I believe that I could help to promote the legitimacy of the relationship between the people and the various levels of government even better than could Mr. Lee. I would vote to support requiring the transmission of certain information to, and independent verification of informed consent of, all parties involved, before a government is delegated authority by the people or by smaller governments. I would also vote in principal dedication to a pluralistic accommodation of alternative viewpoints, and in favor of urging all civil and economic societies to stay true to their ideological cores, undisturbed by the need for moderation, pragmatism, or expedience. Taxes and spending. While 3 of my Democratic opponents have been vocal about balancing government budgets, ending the deficit, and curbing spending, their records and policies show otherwise. Mark Pocan opposed legislation amending the state constitution to limit spending. Both Matt Silverman and Dave Worzala, if not both other Democratic candidates as well, support increasing taxes, and Treasurer Worzala seems to believe that increasing taxes and spending will cause spending to be curbed. Like Chad Lee, I support fiscal restraint in government and free market solutions. I believe that in a time of economic stagnation or recession, rapid growth of government budgets, and the intrusion into the freedom of the market and the personal lives of the people, taxes should not be raised, and consideration of enacting legal limits on government spending should be urged. However, I would aim to outdo Mr. Lee in protecting citizens from big government and heavy taxes by supporting tax legislation only if and when it challenges the predominant modern notions of what forms of taxation are constitutionally and ethically acceptable. I would support attempts to repeal and to judicially invalidate the 16th Amendment, propose a constitutional amendment properly authorizing direct taxation without apportionment, and sponsor legislation requiring that federal revenues be derived only from the product of state duties and imposts, and from an accelerating graduated tax penalizing the creation of income gaps. Elections and business welfare. I would caution voters that a stated personal opposition to big budget campaigns and lobbying often mean nothing when the candidate expressing the sentiment describes himself as pragmatic. I am concerned that Matt Silverman's promise to be pragmatic may reflect a lack of legal and ethical principles, and a personal lack of feeling of responsibility to be consistent. Corporate personhood is not a threat to public influence on elections and to the financial security of Americans as much as our personal corporationhood, and the unchecked power of pragmatic politicians to decide to hand out favors to lobbyists without regard to the letter of the law or to the privity of citizens to deal-making in the government. I would also caution voters that Mark Pocan's status as a small business owner, his record promoting small business interests, and his likely disdain for the strict constructionist interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause could risk increasing inappropriate federal expenditures to finance and favor small business. I believe that this would lend more credence to the growing bailout culture in which government picks winners and losers, not only among large businesses and corporations, but among small businesses as well, and that it would likely increase public distraction, diverting attention away from institutional monetary, taxation, and banking policies, which are more directly responsible for the current economic environment. Federal infrastructure. Unlike candidate Dave Worzala, I would vote to oppose federal spending on infrastructure. Being that the federal government has the constitutional authority to build roads and railroads, I would oppose these activities neither as strongly nor for the same reasons as other infrastructure projects. I would, however, caution against the risks of bureaucratization and financial mismanagement which often result from such expensive undertakings. While I believe that there is a need to improve national infrastructure, I feel that the involvement of the federal government often risks increasing costs, increasing abuse and oligopoly in the infrastructure building market, illegitimatizing the political culture in Washington, and undermining the independence of the states. I would also note that I do not believe that centrally planned national infrastructure projects have historically helped relieve economic stagnation, recession, and depression as much as has drawing down the scope and aggressiveness of our military activities. Gay rights. The victory of Mark Pocan or Kelda Roys would likely lead to a more active and vocal promotion of gay rights in the public sphere. I would caution voters that this could lend credence to the notion that government, and/or all society, should treat people differently because they belong to this or that cultural, religious, ethnic, national, gender, sexual orientation, or differently abled demographic group. While I believe that non-heterosexuals should be protected from discrimination by the public sector, I would caution governments not to intervene in too much of the social economy with the goal of preventing, prohibiting, or restituting discrimination. This is because in the economy and in society, there exist non-institutional forms of discriminatory action which do not either directly, immediately, or at all, constitute the threat of harm against persons and their property. That is, they cannot be easily defended as inherently unethical. On the issue of gay marriage, while I agree with Chad Lee that this issue should be left up to the states, I would take additional steps promoting individual and local sovereignty and independence in this policy area, as well as personal social tolerance and acceptance, which Lee may not be as likely to emphasize. I would urge governments at all levels to enforce all contracts which outline the conditions of such relationships between informed consenting adults, regardless of which words partners to those relationships may wish to use to describe them. I would also urge private persons and agencies of capital and labor not to discriminate against non-heterosexuals, support a repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, and support constitutional amendments requiring the federal government to recognize same-sex unions which are valid in states, and legalizing same-sex unions nationwide. Abortion. A realization of Mark Pocan's position on abortion would have risked that potentially influential third parties other than the doctor and the patient may, by the mere fact of their presence, dissuade patients from undergoing abortion procedures. Being that my Democratic opponents such as Pocan may be inclined to oppose any and all Republican-sponsored women's health policies, they may fail to consider that some Republican legislation may occasionally serve to protect the safety and liberty of the patient. However, the anti-Roe v. Wade platform endorsing the 10th Amendment, espoused by the likes of Chad Lee, is no more preferable than our most democratic policies. I would vote to oppose federal funding for abortion and support an act of Congress which would remove the regulation of abortion from the jurisdiction of the federal courts and place it under control of the states, thus nullifying the Roe decision. I would then support a constitutional amendment legalizing abortion in all states and refrain from interfering in the rights of states to permit governments within them to prohibit abortion and contraception. I would urge the states to permit non-governmental actors and subsidiary governments to compete against one another to provide abortion and contraception, and urge governments at all levels to refrain from requiring abortion providers to transmit unnecessary amounts of non-medical information to patients, but I would also recommend that doctors verify the independent consent of patients. Law enforcement. While a law enforcement policy supported by Democrats such as Mark Pocan and Kelda Roys would likely relieve police from enforcing unnecessary vice laws against marijuana, it would do little to nothing to relieve police from enforcing vice laws against alcohol and tobacco. Such a policy would also compromise the people's ability to defend themselves against intruders and against their government. In a time of multiple perpetual wars, permanent emergency, and erosion of the Bill of Rights, the people need all the help they can get protecting themselves. An increase in citizen self-defense would relieve the burden of the government to protect us, thus de-oligopolizing and making freer the market for security, and also decrease government justification for intervening in the affairs of others on the behalf of the people. I would work to restore the Bill of Rights, procure new privileges for the accused, and make state citizenship optional, and I would oppose attempts by any monopoly government to legalize civil restitution for harming law enforcement officers presenting clear, present, and imminent danger to life while in the line of official duty. I would also urge all governments to allow other governmental and non-governmental actors to register the weapons of their citizens and clients, as all involved parties would agree. Additionally, I would vote to oppose all federal funding for the war on drugs, especially overseas, and to oppose states' bans on illicit and prescription drugs, as well as non-illicit drugs like alcohol and tobacco, by invoking the Interstate Commerce Clause. I would also urge people and governments to be cautious that business owners who are prohibited from allowing smoking on their property consent to the regulation and are justly compensated for any loss of revenue and/or property value resulting from the takings of the right to permit smoking. Immigration. While I would praise Chad Lee for his general support of the 10th Amendment, I consider his immigration policy destructive of the rights of the accused and inhibitive of the freedom of travel. I believe that there is a need to cultivate a comprehensive nationwide immigration policy which is humane and pluralistic, but which also does not threaten the sovereignty and independence of particularly anti-illegal immigration states such as Arizona, Alabama, and South Carolina. The Constitution authorizes Congress to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, and it forbids Congress from prohibiting the migration and importation of persons which are thought reasonable by the states. However, although there is no constitutional provision that would prevent a state from constructing a border fence, there is no explicit authority for the federal government to do so. I would support a constitutional amendment which would prohibit both the federal and state governments from maintaining or continuing to construct fences on our international borders. I would oppose all existing and proposed laws providing for mandatory identification documents for all persons. I would urge all citizens, courts, and law enforcement officials not to extradite illegal immigrants to their home countries unless it can be shown that their ostensible consent to become subject to that country's authority was informed and not under duress, and also that that country prohibits illegal immigration. Moreover, I would urge governments at all levels to grant rights of the accused to both federal subjects and non-subjects alike, which are either on par with or more protective than the Fourth Amendment. Additionally, I would note that opponents of illegal immigration would have less justification for their personal views and legal positions were they to become aware that the federal government has conducted cross-border weapons for drugs programs and arms trafficking and tracking operations which have destabilized and undermined the sovereignty of Mexico and caused death of American border personnel. Voting to stop and prevent, and investigating to uncover the facts about such operations is crucial for restoring America's reputation and credibility abroad, ameliorating artificial antipathy towards minority groups and improving race relations, and saving lives of American civilians, law enforcement officers, and politicians. Social culture and foreign policy. None of my opponents have intentionally made religious and social culture or foreign policy major parts of their platforms. However, and for that reason, I am concerned that their not having strongly condemned our nation's present path in regards to these matters can indicate their indifference and/or complacency to it. This risk is particularly frightening to me, as it should be to all male citizens below the age of 26, as a person who is registered and eligible for selective service, and at a time in history when the world's cultural and military conflict is deepening and could potentially accelerate into a full-scale international nuclear holy war. As both a candidate and as a U.S. representative, I will vocally oppose the subversion of American national sovereignty and interest to the concerns of the Zionist lobby, oppose all attempts to continue to fund arms races between the State of Israel and its neighbors, and call attention to any suspected institutional moves to deliberately exclude or suppress the articulation and communication of anti-Zionist religious, cultural, political, and military policy positions. I'm running for Congress because I support free market and strict constructionist policies which I feel not one of my opponents, even the Republican, either fully nor sufficiently supports. But I'm also running because I support social justice ethics which not one of my opponents, even the Democrats, sufficiently supports. If elected to the 113th Congress from Wisconsin's 2nd District, I would be an outspoken voice supporting dual federalism, American national sovereignty, a non-interventionist foreign policy, the restoration of the civil liberties contained in the Bill of Rights, the freedom of choice, freedom from public sector discrimination, amnesty for all nonviolent undocumented immigrants, a non-interventionist monetary policy, sound currency, and real fiscal restraint. I would be an ardent critic of the current federal monetary, budgetary, taxation, and wage policies, the political influence of all types of lobbies from Wall Street to Israel, and the overly loose, predominantly held interpretation of the General Welfare Clause, which excuses unconstitutional federal spending on military and economic aid to foreign governments, the development of national infrastructure, and loans, favors, and privileges for large labor unions and large businesses. I would also criticize the overly loose interpretation of the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Just Compensation Clause, presidential reorganizational authority of the executive branch, and all laws that unreasonably strengthen the power of the executive, especially to use emergency domestic security and financial powers, and to provide for continuity of government measures which erode civil liberties. If I am elected, I will support the freedom of and from association, voluntary exchange and compliance, and a system of contract law which is the basis of, rather than limited by, all legitimate governance. My voting record will reflect the people's desire to limit and decentralize government, require it to compete in all sectors of the social economy, and embrace free market principles, and restore our republic and our individual rights in a manner that adheres to the letter of the constitutional law the way its framers intended. Please vote for me, Joe Kopsick, for the U.S. House of Representatives from Wisconsin's 2nd District on November 6, 2012. Thank you.